All right, so we have a topic left to finish up in chapter 6, and that has to do with positioning and positioning elements on our screen. So we'll kind of jump in, we'll look at a couple examples and get you on your way on understanding positioning as it comes to your style sheets. So this is kind of hitting this last objective of describe the use of absolute, relative, and fixed positioning. So we'll take a look at that. I'll show you some examples on W3 Schools that should help us to better understand it. I will definitely say this is one of those areas that you play around with a lot more. It's not an exact science all the time, but it definitely is something that makes it a little bit more beneficial as you're working on your pages. So let's just skip through some of this and get to this section on positioning. Alright, ways to position an element. So we actually have a command inside of our style sheet that we can use called position. When we use that position property, it gives us some potential values for it. We can do static, absolute, fixed, and relative, which we'll talk about. And then we have to also set the top property, the bottom property, the left property, and the right property. Those are very similar to us setting margins, except for this is actually telling us where on the page we want this to appear. So this is where we can get some overlapping. This is where we can move stuff around on our page. A little bit different than what we do with floats, but in a different, more precise way. The last thing you see there is the z-index. This is a value that we can give an object, and based off that z-index, it will tell you where in the layer it will be. So if I want to send something to the back, I put a negative. I want it closer to the front. The higher the number, the closer it is to me. So that's how we're going to start taking a look at some of these elements in positioning. So the code that you see here is the HTML code that I have in one of the examples. The example 13 absolute and fixed inside that chapter 6 folder that we took a look at. So it just, as you notice, it's a main inside the body. We have an H1, we have an unordered list, and then we have an aside. And so as we take a look at this, we can play around with some of these values, but basically our aside is inside of our body, and our main is also inside of our body. So we can definitely take some looks at it. So I'm going to go ahead and bring you over here real quick, and we can take a look at that code. So I will kind of go through this code that we have here. I know it's not probably the easiest to see, so let's go in here. We'll get into presentation mode. So if we take a look at some of our code here, you notice that we have a margin set on our paragraph, our body, and here's where everything's kind of coming into play. So the first part is the position of the body. We have it set to relative, and I know we haven't really talked about what relative is, but relative is really how it's positioned in the normal flow. So what comes first? The body's coming first, so that's why it's positioning some things that way. So if we take a look at this page real quick and what we get, we know that this black border is going around our body. This is our main, and then over here is our aside, right? So just kind of keep that in your mind as we're beginning to look at this. So in the aside, here's where the positioning comes in. It's set to absolute. Absolute means it's going to be in a very precise location. And where is that location going to be? It's going to be right 30 pixels and top 50 pixels. So what exactly does that mean? So let's go back out here and take a look. So if you notice, its top is 50 pixels down. Its right side is 30 pixels from the edge. So if our body changes size, it's always going to be in that location. So for example, if I come in here and I set the width of this to be 1,000, and we come out and take a look, you notice it's in the exact same location in conjunction to where we set it, right? And so it's absolute on here. Now it kind of is acting like it's relative, but it's really an absolute value. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in and I'm going to change this back to, let's say 500. Right, so if I put this in 500 and launch it, once again, same thing. It is still the same pixels down, same pixels over from the right. If we would have set like a left property or a bottom property, you know, that's how we can have it. We can move this so it's down closer to the body, but now you're noticing, let's change something here. Let's change this top to be 20 pixels. Oh, my cursor jumped on me there. So if we set this to 20 pixels, and we go take a look at it now, you see that we actually have elements overlapping. So it goes back to that concept that things are layers, and we can manipulate them as we begin working on this. So as you notice that, that's why we're seeing such a weird phenomenon going on there as we begin working on that. So when we say absolute, I'm going to put some of these things back to the way they were. Sorry about that. So we'll set that back to 50. Let's set this back to the 700. And now let's take a look at, like, what if we change this to relative, right? So if I change this to relative, what's going to happen that's different? So I go ahead and launch it, and you now notice our box is down here. So what's happening there? The right, now we're going back to the flow that it appears inside of our object. So where does that box appear inside of our object? It's right here after the main. So now what it's telling it, because it's relative, is it's saying set the top of a side 50 pixels away from main, and the right of a side to be from 50 pixels from main. Well, because it's actually hitting below it, it's kind of it's not even really using that 30 pixels. So you see the difference between relative and absolute. Relative is based off of the object that's inside in order in the HTML code, whereas absolute is based off of the borders that we have inside there. So for example, if I come up here and I change this to absolute, and let's say I put the top to 200 pixels, and I set the left to 300 pixels, right? Now what's it going to do is it's going to actually shift it into that location. The upper left corner is 0, 0, so then as we shift, now this is part of the body, so everything's good to go there. But what would happen if we were changing some of this on, I'm going to set this back to relative, and now if we go take a look at it, when it's relative, it's still in that location because it's being relative from the HTML, which is 0, 0, so it's pushing us down that direction as well. But let's say I came in here and I put in something for my main, and let's say my main has, I'm going to make this a little bit larger so we have a little bit of room, not quite that large. I'm going to get my main, and just to make it easy to see, I'm going to put a background color of, I'll use like a pale color, and I'm going to set its position, and let's say I set it absolute. Then let's say I want it to be top 200 pixels and the left 40 pixels, right? So we go and we take a look, and you notice that it's really hard to see that it did anything, right? Because it's still being based off of that body. So it's not really, if I put a semicolon there, now we should get something. So now you notice that it actually pushed itself out of the body because it's saying it's absolute. So the body without that chunk has no body. And even this is because it's absolute is outside of it. Now if I set this one over here to relative, we go and take a look. Now it's relative to where this used to be. So even though this looks like it's down here, it's not. It's still taking up this space, except it's just being pushed down. So that's how we start kind of moving some stuff around. Now if I set this one to relative, what's it going to be relative to? It's going to be relative to the body. So you notice now it pushed it down because now it's relative to this location right here. When it was absolute, it was based off of this location here. So when you start working with these things, it definitely plays a big deal on thinking how you want to lay things out. It's a little bit, and then you start using a combination of floats and relatives and things like that. Now, let's say I have this guy sitting right here and I want that to be behind it. So in my aside, I can actually set a z-index. And I'm going to set my z-index to -1. So by setting it to -1, it now is behind that location. So our z-index basically really allows us to position things behind and have some overlap. It's really handy to do with different types of images, if you want to use them as things like a logo or things like that. So that's really positioning in a nutshell. Like I said, it's kind of one of those things that we use. I'm not saying you're always going to use it. I'm going to go out to the internet here real quick. And let's see. Inside of W3 Schools, which I like to reference a lot in class and as we talk about things, there's more information on it where it starts talking about fixed and absolute and some of the sticky stuff. So we don't really utilize a lot of those things, but it's definitely something for you to go take a look at. I'm going to show you here's one that's absolute and one that's relative. So there's some good examples. And I think the other thing is just play around with change in values. Becomes very helpful. For instance, here's one on the z-index, and you notice the image is behind it. Just by changing this from -1 to +1, now my image is in front of it. So this definitely gives us a lot more ability to lay things out and to do some different things. I'm going to quick check here. Let's see, CSS layout grid. See if we can find like a grid guide. Let's see. That's not really what I'm looking for. I know there's something out here, and we'll talk about it more when we get into the responsive design. But when we get into responsive design, we look at grid a little bit different. But when we're talking about things like positioning, the thing that you have to remember is this top corner is 0, 0. You don't know what this is going to be. So if you position something to be 1200 pixels over, it's going to be 1200 pixels over, and it may not look the best. So that really wraps up chapter 6 as we start talking about positioning. And so you have, float and positioning depending on what you're going to work on. We'll continue to work on these things. I don't use positioning a ton because I like things a little bit more responsive. So I rarely put something in an absolute location. Most of the time, if I'm doing something absolute, it's based off of an upper corner, or it's inside of another container, right? So remember, when we have things inside of containers, it makes a difference there as well. Let's go back out here. So there's just the style sheet that we were looking at, the example that we were playing around with. We can use absolute positioning to get things over. This one uses a whole bunch of spans. it's in there. I don't really like this example, so we're not going to really look at it too much. But if you're interested in what it's doing, right, the style sheets are here. Everything's being relative to the thing over the top, so you have main H2, and then you're moving it differently. So it definitely gives you some capabilities of putting things into place. So as I mentioned, here's the two assignments that you'll kind of work on using floats. And then we'll get started on chapter 7.